All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Stephanie Bilkey. I'm with Audubon Great Lakes, and I'm just going to kick us off with a few housekeeping items for the final session of the Midwest Migration Network virtual conference connecting birds and people across the Midwest. So just letting you know that this presentation is being recorded. Also, all participants will be muted for the duration of this program today. Take a few moments to locate the participant and chat functions on the Zoom platform. You can participate by using these functions and submit questions or comments using the chat box. We do ask you to use the chat box for questions, but reserve further discussion until the very end of our presentations today. I want to let you know if you're having any technical difficulties, you can email me at stephanie.bilkey@audubon.org, which is STEPHANIE.B as in boy, EILKE @AU, D as in David, U, B as in boy, O, N as in Nancy.org. And that's giving that out for people who might be joining by the phone. You can also send me a private chat using the Zoom chat. Just send that to me, Stephanie Bilkey. And again, the questions that you submit in the chat box will be answered at the end of the presentations today. So to get us started for today's program, I'm going to introduce again Tom Will, who is with the Migratory Program for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Take it away, Tom.
Thanks, Stephanie. And hello, everybody, and thanks for coming back. I think this has just been an amazing conference. I think all the presentations and discussions in the last 2 days have just been extraordinary. And so today's closing program, what we'll do is bring back our four Midwest Migration Network Initiative Leaders, and they'll provide a brief updates on the working sessions that we held this week. The sessions from Tuesday afternoon through this morning. And then we'll follow that with a panel discussion and a question and A session with all of those four initiative leaders. And then we'll bring on Fabiola Rodríguez, who will be our keynote speaker for this afternoon. And Fabiola will turn our attention to one of the endpoints of that full life cycle that we've been talking about, that be the stationary non-breeding season, and will help us to amplify that connecting people portion of our conference theme. We'll follow Fabiola's talk with some questions and answers, and then we'll wrap up with comments by the Midwest Migration Network coordinator, Amber Roth. So, I mean, I really am glad I don't have the job of summarizing the amazing material that was presented, both complex and far-reaching. So I'm going to turn that job over to our four initiative coordinators, and Mark Shieldcastle will be first up talking about the banding and ground surveys initiative. So the floor is yours, Mark.
Thank you, Tom. And this has definitely been a new experience, I guess, in the new world order. There's definitely been some pluses and some minuses, I think, to having to do a conference like this, but Stephanie has just been tremendous in keeping things on track and meeting all the technical problems we've had. I chaired the Banding and Ground Survey Initiative, and we had the first session, which was Tuesday afternoon. I think some of the takeaways I had is one, is just how far the MMN has come from the original meetings we had, and I think kind of Katie Koch's vision of where we could get. I think it's been a tremendous advancement. We still got a long ways to go, but things are falling in place, I think. COVID has kind of put a hold on field work this year. So hopefully from the ground survey initiative, we're looking at kind of get a fresh start going in 2021. It's really, I think the big things from our session, which was really just kind of an introduction to a lot of people, what the initiative is, its purposes. But I think one of the real advantage we have has been a complete buy-in by the Bird Banding Laboratory, who has the regulatory responsibilities for banding. And it's kind of opened up new avenues for them as well, and what they're calling the big project initiatives that could direct banding of land birds well into this century. It's really heightened the importance to me, the importance of getting this network really up and running, to assess the other interests that we can fit it in with, and empower another big data set to get at the questions and needs of migration and our ultimate goals, life cycle modeling and life cycle management of land birds. So I've really learned a lot from sitting in on the other sessions and thinking of how the banding initiative can be tailored to help answer some of these big questions. Is just having all these different tools in the toolbox to work on. So it's really been, for me, I was just getting it out there to a much bigger audience, to a much greater range. I know discussions with the Bird Banding Laboratory over the past couple of years has really been of, let's get the MMN really going, and then they foresee this as the beginning of a national program for migrational banding programs. And I think we're on the start to that. The need to have standardized data keeps getting pushed out there. Just without it, we're limited in what we can do, and it can fit into really all the other initiatives. I think the MMN has really, from this very beginning, done a good job of how these different tools can fit together, and now it's just the completion of the implementation. So I think, Tom, I'll give it back to you. It's pretty much, I think we're on the go, and hopefully we brought a lot of new people into the fold that's now familiar with what the MMN is, and there's hopefully a lot of thoughts going on across the country, in Central America and in Canada as well, of how they can fit in with us.
Thanks, Mark. And I think we've provided ample opportunities in the chat for folks to sign up, both for the Midwest Migration Network itself and for any one of the initiatives. And so really look forward to seeing this, the banding network and the ground survey stuff expand as people come on board to participate in that. So, yeah. So Joel, you're up next, and you'll be talking about the Great Lakes Wind and Wildlife Coalition, which met on Wednesday morning, I think, right?
That's right. Okay, can you see my slide? Take that for a yes. So,
Yes.
just reporting out quickly on our session. Very informative. I think the whole thing went very well. We had two really great speakers, and we had two additional mini presentations that were provided to me by our friends at Fish and Wildlife Service and at Bat Conservation International to provide an overview of some of their work. Just to provide a quick overview, since we are the new kid in town, of course, being brand new, we weren't reporting out on results as much as the other initiatives, but certainly looking forward to the next conference when we'll be able to do so. But just to give everybody a very quick reminder, the purpose of the Great Lakes Wind Wildlife Coalition is to take steps necessary to minimize the impacts of offshore wind energy development in the Great Lakes on birds and bats. And this is really focused around two objectives, which is work that's being undertaken by two committees. The first is bird and bat science. This is really wrapping our arms around the data that's out there with regard to bird and bat distributions in the Great Lakes, and how to synthesize that, find the gaps, and prioritize additional work, and then how to really operationalize that data to inform wind energy facility siting, and then development of best management practices specific for the Great Lakes. Our science committee chair is Dave Lukanen at Michigan State University, and Bob Fisher is our committee chair for the best management practices. So as far as all of our presentations and the information, we had a few important take-home messages. One is that offshore wind energy is definitely an important tool in the combat against climate change. It can deliver a lot of energy, and it can deliver it relatively close to major population centers as a carbon-free source of energy. So obviously this is very important. And also that development is underway in the Great Lakes. And the figures here, the top one is the Trillium project, which was very near approval in Ontario. And below there is Icebreaker, which is off the coast of Cleveland in Lake Erie. And there is discussion about other projects being planned as well. So, so this is already happening. So the coalition is just geared to try to help that industry minimize its impacts. There are many taxa and guilds. We heard yesterday quite a bit about birds. We talked some about bats as well. We know that bats are found over the lakes. There's not a lot of data that we have on that, but we do know that they're there. Obviously, tons of water birds use the lake, and we learn more about, through radar studies, how many nocturnal migrant birds are actually flying over the lakes, and therefore potentially in the windswept, the rotor swept portion where the wind energy facilities are. One of the real big take homes, certainly from Elise's presentation on hotspots, is that there are huge data needs. We need a lot of data to do things like hotspot analyses and really try to figure out where all these things are, but also even on the best management practices front and just even the impacts of these facilities. There's still a lot that we have yet to learn, all of which is going to be very important. But also that there's a lot of good information out there already. There's been a lot of good discussions had. And for both the science and for the BMPs, there's a lot to draw from and a lot to build on. So hopefully we can move forward with this work quickly. And then one very big take home is that siting really is critical in terms of how you minimize the impacts to bird and bats. There are some good minimization measures. There's some mitigation measures, but by and large, a lot of it really does come down to putting it in the right place. So do want to, again, thank our speakers. Thanks, Stephanie, for doing such an excellent job organizing all of this. And here's the contact information for myself and our two committee chairs. Since we are a new initiative, again, we are looking for additional participants. So if you have expertise that you think would lend itself to what it is that we're trying to accomplish, please get in touch with any of us. And I look forward to working with all of you in the years to come. Thanks.
Thanks, Joel. Got to find those unmuting buttons. Yeah, great summary. Really exciting stuff. So next on cue would be Sarah Kendrick, and Sarah's going to tell us a little bit about what's going on and what's likely to happen with the radio telemetry group. So
yes, thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. I think I cut you off, sorry. Hello, everybody. Yes, Sarah Kendrick with the Missouri Department of Conservation. I'm the Telemetry Initiative Lead. We had a great session yesterday. We had about 155 people tune in. I think 244 registered, which almost gave me a heart attack. But it was so cool to see so many people there. So we had 155 people. I really enjoyed seeing the other Midwest Migration Networks Initiative sessions. I really did learn a lot. Thanks also to Stephanie, who kept us running, and she kept me from having that heart attack. We did have a brief poll at the beginning of our session with 3 quick questions, and it showed us there was a wide breadth of folks' locations. Only about, I think, 40 to 50% of folks were in the Midwest who were attending. Others were in Canada or just outside the Midwest in the US. So that was very enlightening. We asked a question about the level of experience with MODIS. Most had heard of it and done some research. About 10 to 20% of folks had built or placed a receiver already on the landscape, and about 10 to 15% felt they were pros or felt very comfortable with the technology. So a wide breadth of people, which was very beneficial to our discussions and our questions. About 50 to 60% of participants had conducted MODIS research or were planning to. About 10 to 15% were planning to in the coming years. So it's very exciting. As many of us know, MODIS is, it's a wildfire. It's taken off. It's going very, very fast. A lot of people want to put up receivers and get information on how to do that. And what do I need? Where do I go? How much does it cost? All these great questions. And so I was in cahoots with Stu McKenzie a lot for this session. And we were talking a lot about how this meeting was kind of an initial springboard for future collaboration and communication. So I hope for it to be that. So just to give an overview of what we talked about, Stu gave an overview of what MODIS is and what it can do, updates to the technology, partnerships with CTT and the use of those tags, and how with those stations we can listen on 2 frequencies, just general what you can do with the technology using some great examples. I gave an overview of Midwest specific efforts. I have our MMN Strategic MODIS Receiver Plan up here for inspiration for you to look at and just figure out how you can fit into that. We heard from Rich Keith from Kalamazoo Bird Observatory in Michigan on efforts to broaden MODIS in Michigan. Annie Bracey with the University of Minnesota at Duluth talked about common term tracking, both local tracking and then the large scale tracking that a lot of us think about when we think of MODIS. Chris Tonner at Ohio State talked about some of his students' work and his work tracking using MODIS in Ohio, and just a lot of really cool examples of how MODIS is used. Lots of great questions in the chat, and many were crowdsourced answers from other MODIS users and participants in the session, which was great. It's one of the most inspirational things about MODIS to me is just the widespread collaborative nature of all of it, this like team feeling of everybody kind of chipping in and helping each other learn it as we go. And this group of people involved with it, I'm always just constantly inspired by the folks involved because everybody's so willing to help and kind. We fielded lots of updates. We had a lightning round where we had people write in the chat updates on if they're putting up receivers, if they have planned to deploy tags. And we got a lot of input from a lot more people than I knew about in the Midwest and beyond. Internationally, really, of who's placing MODIS receivers in and out of the Midwest, across the nation, in Canada, Central and South American updates too, which was just fantastic to see. MODIS is just really exciting. And it was just cool, again, to see that those broad uses for MODIS, both local and then the long distance migratory movements that many of us think about. Again, Stu and I just kind of feel like this is a jumping off point for Midwest collaborations. Talking to him about our next steps and how we can reach out to participants of the session and folks who really want to be involved. Since yesterday afternoon when we had the session, I've already received about 4 emails from people who had seen the session and are wanting to touch base and learn more about the MMN and get involved. So that's great news. So this is just a fantastic opportunity to reach out across the region. I think the conference went very well and touch base with others doing this great work. You know, no doubt we reached so many more people with this virtual conference, I think, than we would have at an in-person one. So it's one of the few bright spots of COVID is the virtual conference. No doubt it has its drawbacks, but it really is reaching a lot more people, I think, than we could have before. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I have high hopes for the future, building this broader network of MODIS researchers and users across the region and beyond. I'm really proud to be part of MMN, and I think it really helps solidify these partnerships and collaborations. So we encourage you to join it and reach out and don't be shy. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to Stephanie for saving you the heart attack, because we need you.
Yes, I know. It was bad. Our first slide had scribbles all over it. So we all had many heart attacks thinking we were been taken over or something, but it all turned out fine.
And we need you to fill in all those little orange dots on the map. So
no pressure.
Okay, great summary. Jeff Bueller, you're up next to tell us what's going on with the radar and acoustics group, which just met this morning. So great job trying to summarize things that happened a mere half hour ago.
Yeah, we finished up about an hour ago. So, and hopefully most people that are on right now were able to catch some of it. So we had 6 speakers talking about sort of ongoing and sort of wrapped up projects, and also sort of projects that are just getting off the ground, and hopefully what might be coming down the pipeline as far as what we're going to learn through radar about migration through not just the Midwest, but across the whole continent. So, and I think they were all great talks, and some of the takeaways from what we're learning, I feel like the radar technology, we're sort of, over the last decade, we've really gotten our sort of legs, and we're starting to, our ability to analyze data and extract, great biological information out of it is really matured. And so we're kind of full steam ahead now, and with being able to focus more on answering research questions rather than trying to, still figure out how do we work with this data. So that's encouraging. And I think some of the basic sort of take-home messages from some of the stopover mapping efforts. We heard from Jessica Alcott at Purdue, who just finished up her PhD. Her project was really sort of inspired by the network and connecting with folks here in the network. And so she was looking at stopover in Indiana. And I think one of the important and novel findings from that study was just some of the how birds are responding to parks and forested areas in urban areas, right? And so she was able to show that there is variability among the places that they stop over in these urban areas related to socioeconomic factors, and also showing some rather steep declines in birds over the last decade, both during stopover and in traffic rates based on the radar data. And then we also heard from Emily Cohen at University of Maryland, and that was a recently finished project so now we have some nice stopover maps for 7 radars around the Great Lakes, and we hope to make those data available for folks to use, maybe to help with guiding MODIS tower placement, trying to capture, hot spots of where birds are stopping over. And one of the take homes from that is that indeed these near shore areas, especially within 20 kilometers, is where we see some really high concentrations of birds during both spring and fall migration around the Great Lakes. And then I talked a bit more about impacts of artificial light, so taking a broader perspective and kind of putting the Great Lakes region into context with the Gulf of Mexico, and looking at differences in how birds respond to light there, and seeing weaker response in the spring, which we think might be related to changes in the age ratios of the populations, among other factors that could be driving that. And then Freda Guo, she's starting a new project, and an ambitious one, to sort of marry eBird data, which can give us species composition, with radar stopover mapping throughout the eastern US. So there should be some exciting discoveries from that project as it gets off the ground. And Adrienne Doctor also shared with us some new approaches to visualizing bird migration with radar and capturing some of the spatial heterogeneity of birds in migratory flight. And a really nice case study showing sort of this band of birds taking off the day after a large storm front came through that seemed to concentrate birds. So, and he mentioned that the Birdcast application, website that the Cornell Lab has established, will hopefully be able to integrate these more fine scale spatial quantification of traffic rates. So I'm looking forward to that, and all the questions that folks will be able to ask with those kinds of data. And then on the acoustic side, we had Jay Mcinty, who I just met through this conference, who's a new professor at Missouri State University, who's doing some really interesting work looking at song repertoire and diversity of song repertoire and Buick Wrens, and sort of reached out to other folks that might be doing acoustic monitoring to that he's open and willing to collaborate. So I think that kind of wraps up what we talked about, and like I said, I think shortly we will have, you know, data products widely available to other folks in the network to be able to use and help them in their own efforts. And I think it's a very collaborative group that are working in this realm, that are always open to collaborating with folks on research questions. So please reach out to folks that were presenting and other folks that maybe weren't presenting but are working in this arena. I'd like to see more integration of radar with these other tools. Like the banding data, you know, one question that comes out of my work that would be, I'd really like to be able to pursue with folks running banding stations is to look at how age ratios vary among sites in relation to how close they are to urban areas. So questions like that we might be able to coordinate, I hope, you know, we can pursue in the future. So thanks again to all the presenters. I think and thank you, Stephanie, for really making the meeting run smoothly. It's been great, and I too am very glad that we seem to have reached out a really large audience, much larger than we would have reached had we had an in-person meeting. So concentrating on the positive, that was a big positive of sort of this virtual framework. So back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Jeff, for that summary. Yeah, and thanks again for the initiative leads in particular, who put together a really solid programs in each of your half-day sessions. I mean, you did a great job organizing, I think, and bringing new voices to all of us. Excellent and great job on the presentations by the folks who participated in each one of those initiative breakout sessions. Yeah, it was a great job. What we're going to do now is do a sort of a panel discussion. And so I think I'd like to ask Jeff, Sarah, and Joel and Mark to bring up your videos so that we can see you all. We'll open up the chat to any questions that folks might have. These questions could be to any one single lead, or they could be to the whole group. And I'd also want to encourage, since this is a panel discussion, that the panelists themselves, Sarah, Jeff, Mark, and Joel, can ask questions of one another. I want to follow up, I'll start it off, I guess, with where you left off, Jeff, which was, and I saw this happening in several of the sessions. People were talking about ways in which one initiative could sort of join forces with another initiative. And in a sense, I want to reel us back a little bit to where we started with Amber's presentation at the very beginning of the conference, where she listed from our strategic plans some of those major driving questions that we have about migration through the Midwest. And we chose as a network to have those questions as be sort of the core of what we were doing, but to break out by the different technologies which might be used to address those questions. So I kind of want us to think about the big questions a little bit more. What are they? And, you know, and where do you see the most productive or, the most productive areas for getting together and sort of answering some of those big questions, sort of what you mentioned at the end, Jeff, in your talk, like thinking about combining some of the banding effort with the radar effort to understand a little bit more about how birds learn to avoid or whatever. So, you know, what we can do to sort of join forces a little bit more strategically. Any thoughts on that? So we could start with, you know, what do you see as the most promising frontier for collaboration among technology initiatives?
Are you asking anyone, Tom?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarah.
I think I think there's clearly from the telemetry initiative, Jeff just talked about, you know, we look at the radar, we figure out the areas to put MODIS receivers, then we work with the banding folks to help us put on the MODIS tags. It all works together. There have been a lot of questions, even in our session, about how we can use MODIS to track birds through or around wind farms too. And so, I mean, it's kind of like this was all planned for all to work together. So yes, there are very, very clear ways in my mind, ways that we can collaborate. It's just getting the folks in our region and beyond who say, I have this research question, and then linking up me and Jeff and Mark and Joel and saying, how can we use our contacts in our fields to bring this all together to like write big grants or that's how I see it, I guess, moving forward, is using these contacts and tools to really make big grants and funding opportunities and research projects just that much more huge and powerful on a region-wide scale and hemispheric with migration to really get those funds and get those answers as best we can.
Yeah, and I think it's good that knowing, you know, who is actively doing work in the network, like you said, so we can connect with other folks that are doing work so that we can leverage, you know, our expertise in these different areas to go after some bigger grants that, you know, can ask bigger questions, right? I think that's one of the leverage of the network is we want to try and ask maybe macro scale questions, or at least questions that are going to have to rely on, you know, asking questions at more than just one study site over a 2-year cycle, right? So that's where we really need to be thinking about what are these more difficult questions that require a more coordinated effort to be able to address.
Absolutely.
And I'll say from my perspective, I mean, I think Sarah really hit the nail on the head. I mean, for the wind energy question, I think it's really limitless, the collaboration that can happen. I mean, during the wind session, the most active discussion in the chat box was about MODIS and how MODIS can be applied. Yes. And, you know, certainly all of the stuff that we were hearing about radar and Jeff was talking about papers that, you know, have really been seminal for this question of risk assessment and siting for offshore wind energy facilities. And obviously the banding data is going to be enormously important, particularly when you're looking at sites that are close to the shorelines of the Great Lakes. So I'll say, you know, we're very fortunate that we do already have two of our 3 initiative leaders on committees for the coalition. Not naming any names there, but it's, yeah, I see limitless opportunity for this all to overlap, and I was really encouraged to see what information's already out there, the experts that are already in the network, and just thinking how to best put all of that together.
I'll just kind of add in there from the banding initiative perspective, I can see it's kind of twofold. One is to provide the standardization to have a big data set that's comparable across the region and ultimately across the country. You know, consider what the banding lab's direction would like to see it go. But that's just one, that data set. Then, you know, if you were able to throw the banding information into a couple of the studies that went over today in the radar, where they use that and eBird and like that. Now you could bring in the qualitative data of age and sex and things like that. You really can learn a lot more. The second part of where I see the value of the banding initiative to the others is that most of these require some sort of coordination with somebody doing something on the land. MODIS especially. If you want to get a well-designed study of getting tags put out there, it's nice to know who may be capturing those type of birds so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so it provides a cooperators list for the other initiatives. If you know where you have certain banding stations or any extent that's of high quality data production, that may play a role into where you may set up radar, a mobile radar type thing, or how valuable it could come toward wind and wildlife questions as well. So I see all of them fitting very well together and complementing each other. One of the things we've floated out here in Ohio, even though we more, our angles come from the banding part, is that MODIS become a requirement in pre-construction wind facilities. That, right now they're not looking at migration, nocturnal migration, which is supposedly the greatest risk. MODIS is another method other than radar itself, as a way of maybe looking at how these birds are crossing the landscape. And so there's some real value there that where MODIS, you get kind of the twofold. It informs the risk assessments, but it also provides a funder in getting the networks up in the ground and spreading out that whole system then that answers a myriad of questions that other people have and just need more sites on the ground to pick up these birds.
Yeah, that's certainly the limiting factor. I get so jealous when I see studies in Ontario and the Northeast because they're just everywhere, and this is what we're working toward, that grid over farther west. But
yeah.
Well,
We've had interest from Ohio Division of Wildlife that this may become part of the protocol requirement in the state of Ohio.
all great answers. And I mean, one thing I was thinking of is this whole idea of, I'll use the P word, prioritization, but an aspect of coordination is kind of trying to make some decisions where, funding isn't necessarily flowing everywhere. And I think Joel's comment and Mark's comment in particular about, a really good site for MODIS towers would be in areas where we need to provide some science to potential wind development. That would be a high priority. That's sort of a no-brainer. And maybe even banding in association with that. I shouldn't say maybe even banding, because what we can discern from individual records of birds is really powerful when combined with some of these much more broad looks at the migration. It also struck me, Sarah, that when I look at the orange dots in the MODIS geographic wish list, that some of the work that the radar group showed us this morning, where you could see hotspots along the shorelines, that those would be probably priority areas, I would think. If we know there are lots of birds there, then those should probably be areas where we can put MODIS towers as a first step, because we'll have a greater probability of getting those distant pings, as well as perhaps doing some local studies. One of the things that came out of the MODIS portion of the program was not just coordination among initiatives, but also within the MODIS community, kind of pairing that
absolutely,
those local studies with the idea of the excitement of catching a bird from getting a ping from South America. So
yeah, no doubt. And I just want to drive home again, I said it during our session, but we just cannot ignore placing more receivers on those pathways through Central America and South America and Caribbean. And so anyone who's trying to get funding to place receivers up here, I always try and throw in some down there if it's a possibility. Always ask those questions if you can fund international efforts like that, because it's just as important for those hotspots for sure.
well, thanks for bringing up that theme. So maybe that's a good question for some of the other initiatives leads. Where do you see the best nexus for the kind of work you're doing in the Midwest, and making connections with your technologies across international boundaries? So where do you see that? Where do you see the promise there for actually doing full life cycle work with your respective bailiwicks?
Well, I can speak, to the radar end of things. We have now, Environment Canada has made a giant leap in making their data freely available. So sort of within agency. The Weather Service is within Environment Canada as well, but they have agreed to make the data available for biological research within Environment Canada. So that is great because there were barriers to getting access to data. And so we have, figured out how to process Canada radar data. We've worked with Mexico radar data. I think there's a project now they're using radar data from Colombia. And so we're slowly kind of expanding out to other countries that have weather surveillance radars to try to process data there as well. I think Brazil has a good network of weather radars too, but a lot of that's just been untapped because, like in Mexico, their weather service isn't as coordinated, and so they don't have a central repository for data. It's not publicly available, so there are some major obstacles to working with surveillance radars in other places. We are very blessed to have the NexRad network, and all our radar colleagues outside of the US keep telling us how lucky we are to have that, because even in Europe, they have to pay for data. It's not as well coordinated. So, but yeah, we're starting to expand to other places that we can explore.
I think from the banding perspective, to answer your question, Tom, is the life cycle modeling teams that through North American Bird Conservation Initiative like that's been working for some time. That was one of the first things identified was this big hole, was migration. We have the MOSI program for wintering and maps for breeding. So we've tried to help start filling that gap in the life cycle as far as having coordinated type data to really efficiently inform life cycle modeling. This can't be just a Midwest initiative. It needs to be a continental one. So, that's kind of the next step, I think, is of getting this to work properly here and moving on, to the bigger, and maybe provide the information that can help MAPS and MOSI maybe even reassess their directions and how it can fit into the life cycle modeling as well. When we look at the only models that really exist, life cycle models exist, are waterfowl. And many of the very important parameters, age ratio, survivorship, like that, comes from migration studies. And so I think we can mirror that, improve on that, because we have the ability to have spring migration data as well, which really isn't available in waterfowl, which will help inform winter survival. There's a lot of things we can do there that will expand looking at the life cycle models as we get a standardized, coordinated data set that is comparable across the range.
So this theme of coordination, and working together keeps coming up. One of the questions from the chat is it possible for the Midwest Migration Network to collect information from researchers? And I assume by that I mean researchers that are, throughout the sort of academic community in the Midwest, to find out what questions are being pursued by individual principal investigators so they can be linked to others with whom they could be or should be collaborating. So again, trying to provide some sort of format or forum for that sort of sharing of information and potential work is the way I'm reading this question. Do you have any thoughts? Do folks have any thoughts about how that could be facilitated or made easier? Or
I think that Amber might be better to answer on this, but that seems like part of the website of the MMN is a research, where different research projects are put in there so everybody knows what other people are working on. Maybe that needs to be, that could be an initiative in itself as far as research coordination, but or that could be integrated in each of the initiatives. But that may be something for the steering committee to look at. Is that something that maybe needs to be brought back up to the forefront and re-looked at?
Yeah, and I know I've appreciated Bill Miller posting papers of relevance sort of just on his own, and so it would also be nice to have maybe a page that just where people post papers as they publish them that have relevance to the network too, because that's another way of getting to know who's doing what in the region.
Yeah, last year I reached out to folks in the Midwest that we knew of who had Modus projects, and I was just blown away just in the last year looking at all the people in the chat yesterday saying what projects they were doing and what receivers they were putting up, and it's hard to keep up with. But yes, I think that maybe we can figure out some way where that's a perk of becoming a member of the MMN, is if folks are willing to share their contact information and their research interests and what they're doing, that we can share that list and just to encourage that collaboration. And Amber, did you have?
Yeah, I was going to chime in. These are all ideas that we have talked about in the communications committee of the Midwest Migration Network. And I think that our limiting factor is capacity to put that information together and put it on the website. So I think that's where we might need more assistance from perhaps new folks that want to get involved in the network. Because I think those are all things that we have talked about doing for all of the initiatives, highlighting our member projects, and it's just not something we've had the ability to take on, but it's a great idea and it would really help with collaboration. So I completely agree with the suggestion. So.
Yeah, if we could even just have a Google Doc where people can post their publications and the links to them that people can just do on their own, that might help ease the burden.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd add to that I see this coordination thing as being a two-way street, so to speak, that, that researchers in academia or wherever have their interests that they like to pursue. But I can also see it being looked at the other way. If this community in the Midwest Migration Network says, here are our key questions, here are the things that we think about. If you're interested in studying migration, here are the burning questions that we think are really important. Take a look at these and think about, how you might be able to fashion your research around some of these questions. So it's kind of a two-way street, and making those questions both available and really being part of a community generation might be maybe another way of looking at that two-way communication, that two-way street. I think of groups like the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group, which got a lot of their powerful information by coordinating a set of parallel studies across, 7 different sites spread across the range of the species, and by having different researchers doing the same sort of protocol or very similar studies, we're able to gain a lot of power that could be lead to range-wide inference. And I thought that was a very great way that's a great model for academia and conservation to sort of pair up and think about, well, I want to do this work, but I really want to have some benefit. I'm seeing a bunch of questions in the chat, which I think might be good questions for other folks to answer. I want to shift a little bit, because one of the things that came up in different conversations over the last 2 days was the way in which there's a relationship between migration and urban centers. And so thinking a little bit about conservation, where do you see the leverage between the kinds of things that we're finding out, the questions we're asking, and the ability to engage urban communities in bird conservation, particularly around migration issues? Where do you see the big intersections or nexi there? Or nexuses, if that's the right.
Well, one thing that I think it's important is to recognize that we're not going to save the birds based on just preserved lands and managed lands, right? Like the birds, there are probably a lot more birds that are using areas near people, right? In heavily developed areas, and we need to embrace that. We need to think about, how do we manage those areas, or how do we bring the community in to help people, even if it's changing the composition of the plants in their backyard, right? Planting more non-native plants that are going to provide insects and fruit to host these migrants that are coming through. It's, I think we, you know, and I would appeal to the folks that are running banding stations. We need more banding in urban areas, right? To let us know how the birds are faring in those places. They may not be as appealing, right? Because maybe it's not a nice natural area or preserved area that you're working in, but I think from the birds' perspective, those are really important places too, and we should give them their due sort of recognition of their importance in the larger scheme of supporting bird populations.
I agree, Jeff. I don't know. I mean, just with increasing development, they just have fewer options than to areas. And so, yeah, I think adequate study of them in urban areas is very important as well. One thing I wanted to bring up about urban, I think of like school groups and clearly just community centers, is using Modus, especially as an educational tool. Modus has educational packets, and your school can sign up on the website and track different things and just become involved in the educational aspect of it. The MMN has put in for a funding opportunity through Audubon to link up urban centers with Modus and put up a few Modus receivers to use it as an educational. And my mind just always often goes to education when I think of urban areas, just because Modus and migration are just such a moving topic that it just doesn't take a whole lot to really hook people with these stories. And it's just, I think one of the biggest hurdles is us as biologists creating those stories, that communication piece to really get that out there. So I think people in the natural resource field always need help with that as well. Communication, I think, is a massive threat to natural resources because we're biologists, but there's a lot of potential, I think, for Modus and education pieces too.
Yeah, no, I think we're all familiar with the tremendous educational value of bird banding in terms of
Absolutely.
getting people excited and building capacity. It's similar to what you described, Sarah, in terms of you know, a Modus tower and building projects around that. So, I mean, obviously there's a push-pull in the banding issue because you're actually handling live animals, but I think there's definitely some power to be gained by thinking about the way in which we bring the next generation of conservationists into the fold and how important that is, as you just said. I'm going to turn to a kind of specific question because I think it also has some ramifications with the current discussion, and that comes from Darren Carlson, who says, seems there should be more discussion of the costs and benefits of Modus versus satellite tags. What is the most effective, both in terms of cost and results, method going into the future? What should we continue to invest in these big networks of Modus towers, or should we be thinking about what's going on with, say, the Icarus project? If the Modus and net is the pie in the sky, how do we combine these technologies to build the most complete picture? I think Darren almost answered his question.
Yeah, I do think it's a combination. A lot of those initial questions that Darren asks, it depends on your question, right? It depends on what you're trying to learn and what your species is. Up until really recently with Icarus, like a few weeks ago, I think when it launched, or a week, we didn't have the capacity to use these technologies. Even 2 years ago, starting to put up Modus receivers in Missouri, now there's CTT, now there's something different. And it's really cool to see Modus and CTT partner to kind of try and change with that changing technology to make themselves, keep themselves relevant as they move forward with it. It's just all changing so quickly. Yeah, I think, Stu started off with his first slide yesterday in the session saying it's not the end all be all. Modus isn't the best way to track birds. It's one of many tools that all need to be used together to really kind of, like Darren said, piece together to build the most complete picture of those different portions of the life cycle of which technology works best for your study species in your question. So it's kind of, I hate to give a non-answer like that, but a lot of us are just trying to keep up, with the technology, and everybody's trying the new thing every few months. So it's a process to try and adapt.
I asked Pete this same question, and Pete's response was, you know, well, I said, like, is Modus going to go away? He said, no, Modus is great. It's not going to go away. Every one of these technologies has their strengths and weaknesses. The trick is to be artful in the way we combine those technologies specifically to answer questions. So I think, and I took that to mean the questions that we're asking should help us shape the way in which our technologies interact with one another. And there's great power. It's the old statistical idea that was floating around in the 80s, which was strong inference, right? If you converge on the same result by looking at it from different angles, then you have some proof that your power to interpret reality is actually approaching reality. So I think those are really good questions. I mean, there's not going to be a clear answer in every case, but I think really understanding the strengths and weaknesses and which technology to use. So not necessarily be driven by our favorite technology, but be driven by the question and the openness to combining our which we've seen plenty of, and I think in the presentations today, pairing eBird with radar and so on and so forth. So.
Well, absolutely. And those questions need to be asked if agencies and other NGOs, anyone who's putting up this technology, people are going to ask, well, why are we spending this much money? You know, and to that, people in my department have said that too. They brought it up. Well, the technology is changing a bunch. Is this going to go away? And to answer that, I say that it's kind of awesome that Modus is an old technology. It's radio telemetry, and they've fashioned it in a way to be this massive collaborative thing across the hemisphere. So it hasn't gone away for all that time. I don't foresee it going away, but yeah, it's different technologies for different questions. And it's relatively very cheap. You know, it's open source, how to build, a sensor gnome and how to create that on your own, which I've always loved also, that they want everybody to be able to build it, whether or not you have thousands of dollars to build it. So I think they're trying to be as adaptable as possible.
Well, thanks. It's a great discussion. Really appreciate. I think we have some great leaders in the network, and I'm really makes me proud to be part of the Midwest Migration Network.
Tom, would you mind if I address one question here that I think?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Sarah. We have a couple.
So Roger asked, as far as expanding telemetry work, I'm thinking Modus, would it make more sense to have state groups try to coordinate their efforts, or should it be more regional? So again, non-answer to that, I think both. So each state or group that you're trying to put up Modus receivers for, they need a champion. And it's really hard to identify those people who have a little bit of extra time to learn the technology and really be that champion to try and coordinate efforts. So while we have people who are on this call who may have been in the session or who love Modus, if you all have a little bit of leeway in your jobs, I mean, Lord knows I don't, none of us do, right? But we have these passions for these topics that we, bend our time to make time for. So if you're in a state that doesn't have very good coverage, please reach out to me, and you are willing to take on a little bit of extra work. I mean, it needs a champion and someone to carry that forward to inspire and educate people about Modus in your state and the region. But no doubt in Missouri, I think it needed someone to take up that mantle and tell people about how it works and be kind of a resource as they're moving forward. So I encourage you guys to get more involved in that if you like Modus and you want to see it expand in your state. So thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Sarah. No, that's a good pick, and we need champions. And so we're gonna shift gears now and move on. Fabiola, I think, is going to be our next speaker. So I'll introduce Fabiola, and I think this is a great way to finish out the conference, coming back to that idea of full life cycle with birds, and really kind of paying attention to the one of the ends of the full life cycle, which is what happens during the stationary non-breeding period or the wintering period. So Fabiola Rodríguez hails from Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and she's currently a doctoral candidate at Tulane University. She's also a research collaborator with the Mesoamerican Development Institute, which I believe is based in Massachusetts, and she's researching the overwintering ecology of migrating birds in a coffee production landscape in north central Honduras. Fabiola began her career as a biology undergraduate at the University of Honduras And she turned a zoologist, and then she turned a bird center zoologist inspired by one of her professors, Sherry Thorne. And Fabiola won an internship with the Park Flight program. And I'll just make an aside, that was a fantastic program while it was still going on for building international capacity and bringing Latin Americans into the park system in the US and making those connections. She received training as a bander through the MAPS program in New Mexico and Colorado. And that blossomed into additional work, which she did at MOSI stations in Honduras. She then pursued a master's at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, studying the Honduran emerald. And due to her tremendous enthusiasm for birds, really, she started showing up at various meetings and showing up on my radar as what I saw as one of the bright spots in international conservation networks at that time. Word has it that Fabiola's colleagues have conferred upon her as a bird totem, a tropical wren, although Fabiola says she's always been really fascinated by the furnariids, the wood creepers and ovenbirds of Central America. Her early impact misnetted bird was a blue-crowned motmot, you know, who can top that? Captured in a workshop that was led by Camila Gomez. And of course, Wilson's warbler is something that she really holds as a very special bird, and you'll find out about why that is. In her studies in the Euro region, Fabiola works directly with Honduran community members, and she devotes a large portion of her time to mentoring early career Honduran scientists, which is one of the reasons we chose her to amplify this theme of connecting people through the migrations of birds as part of our network program today. So Fabiola, thanks so much for joining us in the Upper Midwest. The stage is now yours for presenting on connecting communities and monitoring overwintering habitat quality of Midwest migrants.
All right. Well, as everybody, I'm doing a check if you can see this banner from World Migratory Bird Day as confirmation.
We can.
Okay, excellent. So let's thank you, first of all, for this introduction. And thank you to the Midwest Migration Network for inviting me to be part of this conference. This is my first virtual conference, and I am really happy with how this went. I learned a lot about different initiatives. So, you know, let's start by just a couple of announcements. You see in this slide a little square bracket. My idea is that if you want to have the speaker minimized, then you can place the speaker in this box. I should have an empty spot in all of my slides for the speaker. This may not be possible depending on how you like to view your screens. So without further ado, I'm going to begin. First of all, this isn't a talk about one particular project or one particular study. In fact, I have a list of other people in this slide because it was an effort. You know, I like this phrase of "it takes a village," and I think that, you know, to represent different themes, I have to, you know, collaborate with different people along my, my career, my experiences. So I want to first place in context of this conference, this talk. So I'll start by saying that a network, you know, we all know it's a group or system of interconnected people or things. And a monitoring network such as the Midwest Migration Network connects people interested in the topic of migration, birds, conservation, education, and maybe more. So how does the work conducted by Midwest Migration Network resonate with me? You know, I am from Honduras, Latin America, and my focus mainly is with the overwintering ecology of migratory birds. That is the topic I am studying in my PhD. But just like a network, you know, you can see here a nebula of points, maybe the points that the Midwest Migration Network is studying, and with the research questions that can be reflected as a point in the center. although not directly connected, it is still a point connected to research questions that people pursue in the wintering grounds, be it for overwintering or for migration. So as part of today's meeting, in which connecting birds and people is the theme, I will use this opportunity to share my experience with research, which coincidentally connects with monitoring efforts, communities where I work, and conservation. So this is a very broad outline of the 3 different themes that I will be sharing with you for those members of the audience that like to have some guidance of what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to tell you right off the start what is the main takeaway from this presentation. And that is the theme of the Midwest Migration Network Conference, that birds connect us. And 3 different sub-take-home messages from this is, we need to continue connecting people via birds by continuing to boost work in the overwintering grounds, Latin America. But not only do we need that for more data, we need to support more communities or training as an example of how to connect with people. And then we also need to seek and support conservation initiatives that are comprehensive. So starting with the first theme, sort of like an Act 1, monitoring overwintering migrants. While I began working with birds in 2008, it was during my internship in New Mexico in 2011, where I was focusing more on learning the ins and outs of bird banding, that I had a valuable aha moment. It stuck to me how birds we were banding in New Mexico in the onset of the fall, such as this Wilson's warbler, were not going to stay in the US year-round. And I had seen and worked with migratory birds before in Honduras, but this moment was when I started to acknowledge that migratory birds are a shared natural resource among the countries of North America, Mesoamerica, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. And so monitoring of migrants in the winter in Latin America is a piece of any migration or migratory research network. So this slide is not meant to be an extensive review. Rather, I just want to put in your radars and in the context that the overwintering grounds, composed of this geography that you see here, research there is uneven. The countries that are circled in showed up in the studies that I cite on the right as countries that had the most research conducted in the field of ornithology. So for many reasons, research is not even, and there's still plenty to learn, not only about migratory birds, but also about neotropical resident birds. So this allows me to segue into an opportunity or an initiative that allows us to have a scaled up monitoring of overwintering migrants. And that is the MOSI program. The MOSI program, for its initials in Spanish, which is I have there in the first line, stands for the Monitoring of Overwintering Survival. And it is a mirror program to the MAPS program, which most of you are all familiar with, which is the Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship program. Both of the programs were initiated by the Institute for Bird Populations. And I like their names because they initially tell us what they're after. They're after those key variables of productivity and survivorship. This is an image that shows you where MAPS and MOSI stations are. So in Canada and the United States, represented by blue dots, you see that the MAPS station has received information from up to 1,300 stations with up to 2.5 million records. The mirror program, the MOSI program in Latin America, has compiled up to this point up to 200 stations, which maybe not all of them have been active for all of the years, but certainly we're going to learn some of them have been active since its inception. And MOSI stations have collected up to 300,000 records. And records of what? Just as a quick overview, because I think that a lot of the audience members are familiar, the MOSI and MAPS programs are after the variables or things you can measure from a bird in hand that you see in their column on the left. This is what's measured in each of the MOSI stations, and we're after, and MAPS stations, and we're after what's on the column to the right. So like you see, with this, there are big questions that can be addressed, such as what factors may be driving avian population declines. And if you have MAPS and MOSI, where are problems more acute, on the breeding or non-breeding grounds? So with all of these years, so just to mention the MAPS program initiated in the early 1990s and the MOSI program initiated in 2002, it's no surprise that with all of those records, there has been a lot of data that has already come out in publications. The MAPS program has yielded up to 90 peer-reviewed articles and many reports. And the MOSI program and the data has yielded up to 44 peer-reviewed articles. And beyond the main topic of each of these programs, which I tried to represent in this word cloud, you know, the MOSI data set has been used by Latin American researchers to answer different types of questions that go from analyzing in a collection of MOSI stations if we can see movement strategies. So the work of Ruiz Gutierrez and al. And collaborators, for instance, used 14 countries' data to estimate the probability of persistence of migratory birds along a latitudinal gradient represented by MOSI stations. But other researchers used this to better understand the natural history of birds, and we see publications in this as well. So this shows you that the platform of monitoring overwintering migrants has this capacity to expand itself and maybe even connect to some of those initiatives that were talked about in this conference. As an example of expansion in types of data collection and collaboration, the MOSI program recently started to collaborate with the Bird Genoscape project. And this is within the topic of migratory connectivity. So while the MOSI stations are stations in the overwintering grounds, there is a capacity to step outside of this phase of the annual cycle and answer bigger questions about the life cycle. We learned from Pete Mara's talk at the beginning of this conference that studying migratory connectivity and some phases away from the breeding phase is a step in the right direction to think about full annual cycle biology, but also conservation. So what happens within this collaboration of MOSI stations and the Bird Genoscape project? The Bird Genoscape project tries to delineate genetic specific populations of some migratory birds in their breeding grounds. And then if we collect DNA such as that present in feathers of some of the target species, such as the Wilson's warblers in say Mesoamerica, depicted in this map, we're able to assign where that bird came from. So assign an origin based on genetics. Kristen Rueg and collaborators published this paper that pretty much shows what the Genoscape project is about. In the image to your left, you will see the delineation of different genetic populations for the Wilson's warblers in North America. And then when you collect data from the birds in their wintering grounds, you're able to build something that's on the right of this image, which what this is telling us is a representation of the connectivity. So birds that are overwintering in southern Baja or western Mexico can likely come from populations of coastal California, the California Sierras, or Pacific Northwest. So we can see how this program has the capacity to expand. Now, all of this data comes from the stations, and it is collected by people. I have had the opportunity to be at MAPS and MOSI stations and learn incredibly from both. And this ties to my second theme, which is connecting communities. And in this sense, I mean communities in the aspect of whom we're working with on the ground when we're doing this work. So I consider it the main component of this talk. It is impossible for me to mention all of the MAPS and MOSI volunteers and collaborators. I wish I knew them all, but focusing on the MOSI program, it is in great part volunteer-based. And what you see here is a collection of collaborators, some of which have participated since the beginning and continue to work in ornithology and conservation to this very day. And this is a good moment for me to highlight MOSI stations that have neared 2 decades of operation. Remember that I told you that research in Latin America was uneven? I also told you that it could be because of different factors. So against any difficulties, these 4 MOSI stations have managed to compile thousands of records throughout the years. So to hone in on the community component, we're going to travel to the Nicaraguan stations, the MOSI stations of the El Jaguar Reserve in Nicaragua, led by Lily Chavarria and George Trio, whom I have the pleasure to know. So the orange spot that you see is where these stations are located in Nicaragua. And there are really 2 stations within this reserve. One of them, Café, represents a coffee farm that is surrounded by forest. And the other station reflects bosques, forest, mature forest in this area. So the MOSI stations have the ability to connect with communities by being centers of capacity building. What we see here is an image of the MOSI family in the beginning of the program in this long-standing monitoring station, where a total of 55 people have volunteered or been trained. And I want you to pay special attention to the children on the right bottom image. We may see them again in this presentation. This is a crew that was very excited to start this program and continue to work hard for the collection of this data. So if capacity building can be a tool to connect with where you are doing your work, it certainly could be a tool to expand beyond those station frontiers, if we call them that. And El Jaguar crew leaders, Lily and George, have also participated in capacity building with other stations within Nicaragua as well, such as the yellow dots that we see here in this map. And in this image to the left, we have those collaborators that have come from these other locations, other habitat types to train at El Jaguar. And 20 years later, those children that I told you to pay attention to in that image before are still there, working in ornithology, part of the community, and still learning and contributing. So I think that this compilation of images is what resonates with me, because this has the collection of data, has this human aspect that we need to keep in mind. So what has this operation of MOSI stations left behind in a place like El Jaguar? Well, I have a quote here that I took from Doña Lily, but she also mentions that she shared with me that having these MOSI stations as a platform for monitoring have allowed for partnerships and collaborations with other people, maybe with single species study focuses. So there's been work conducted at this place on golden-winged warblers, the wood thrush, Wilson's warbler, and others. On a personal note, she indicates that it particularly inspired her to write The Birds of Nicaragua, a field guide. So that resonates with me, capacity building. So I'm gonna take you now to where I'm doing my work in Honduras. For my PhD, I am working in north central Honduras. It is purely a working landscape. So what you will find is the dominant land use, which in this case is going to be coffee, and interspersed some patches of natural vegetation or secondary forest. I like to call it a coffee gradient, because what you see in this landscape is a variety of coffee farm types that range from the bottom left corner, which is sun-grown coffee, no trees, to shade coffee, which can take a variety of forms and be interspersed, sparse or not so sparse, to, this is not a best image, but another scheme where forest is being spared and allowed for regeneration, even in some cases, next to the coffee farm. So my point with bringing my study here is that if being an ex-volunteer of MOSI myself, and if MOSI is a platform to learn, then perhaps there is a way I can use the MOSI initiative ideals and incorporate those in my study. And that is what I decided to do. So in this area, I'm focusing only on 2 species, Wilson's warbler and the wood thrush. And I aim to understand how these species are using this coffee gradient. Of course, there are multiple studies from which I am building up, especially in relation to migratory birds and coffee. My contribution and our contribution with the collaborators here is that for the case of Honduras, we want to build a land cover map that allows us to refine this this map. I'm sorry, I'm having a connection issue here, and I don't know why. Okay. Let's hope it doesn't. Seems like my computer is having issues. I'm so sorry. Okay.
We can still hear and see everything, Fabiola.
Yeah, maybe we can go on then. So that is one of the main focuses. But in order to connect with the communities, I have decided to adapt the MOSI protocol and to be able to collect data and make the most of capacity building. Here I show you my collaborators, David on the left, Dennis Velasquez, who's part of the Quebrada Seca community in my study area, and Dario Alvarado. But this opportunity and this framework of collaborating has also expanded beyond the bird work, and our work in Euro has been able to expand and support other researchers such as Kelly and Martin, who are working with invertebrates in this region, specifically aquatic invertebrates, and Farlam, who works with small mammals and bats. But all of these biologists have in common not only the eagerness to learn and to contribute to the science, but also to contribute to conservation schemes. They're all affiliated to the Mesoamerican Development Institute, and I'm going to talk to you now about this conservation initiative that I am participating and collaborating with, which is the Euro model. And who brings to you the Euro model? The Euro model is brought to you by the producers of that study area in North Central Honduras, the people from the communities that are affiliated to the production, MDI, and the researchers. And to introduce the Euro model's components, I'm just gonna very quickly bring you to what is it that's modifying the landscape, and that is the coffee production. So coffee is produced in the countries in red in the top left. Honduras is a top exporter within Central America. And this is the first way how coffee transforms the landscape. In Honduras for export, many of the farms are sun farms. And if you scale that up, that has the capacity of changing a landscape. Once the beans are collected, then you need a method to dry those beans in a homogeneous way. And that is by using fuel wood that comes from forests. So as you can see, many links in the chain happen to have an impact in habitat. So the Euro model tries to tackle this in different ways. One is through IOC, a method that tries to spare or manage in a 1-to-1 ratio farm and forest. And then if the vision is to scale this up, and this is a good idea of expanding habitat outside a protected area, which touches on what Jeff Bueller just mentioned earlier, because we need to think of conservation outside protected areas. The second is a carbon market. So apart from coffee coming from IOC being sold at a better price within the region, if you are not using the forest, then you're not using it. And for a producer, that means no income. So MDI is trying to build a volunteer international link to a carbon market. And currently it's in the process of certifying this carbon so that it can be an ongoing theme. Finally, we have the solar hybrid drying method, and instead of using fuel wood, it uses solar panels and biofuels that come from other crops, including some of the waste of the coffee. So these three things conform the Euro model. And as you can see here, if we have a modified coffee farm to cup chain, we could see that we could make an impact. So I am closing up, and I would like to thread this if you're thinking, so what do I take from this talk? I think that I'm going to go back to the main message, and that is through these three themes, birds connect us. We need to have more support in the overwintering grounds and boost that work because we need data. But not only do we need data, we need to connect with the communities, and we need to do more training, especially to bring up or even out that representativity geographically. And lastly, we need to seek and support conservation initiatives that are comprehensive. So lots of people to thank, but I would like, we as a group would like to extend our gratitude to volunteers, producers, research team, collaborators in academia, and El Jaguar specifically wants to thank Audubon, North Carolina, Curtis Smalling, and then other institutions that make this possible. If you want to learn more about any of these initiatives, I invite you to look at these websites, or just feel free to contact me. And with that, first of all, I'm sorry, something's happening with my computer. And second, thank you for the space.
Thanks, thanks so much, Fabiola. That was really great. I mean, at first thought, we think, oh, coffee, people, birds in Honduras, what's the connection? And you just did a great job tying those things together, that seem to be as complex in their own right as the very birds we're tracking in their lives. So yeah, just a great job. I really appreciate it. So thanks so much for coming to us. You know, I think what I'd like to do now is open up the chat to anyone who would like to ask questions of Fabiola's. That would be great. And I'll try to field those, at least see how that goes. You're getting lots of thanks. We'll give a moment for those questions to come in. What is your current research?
My current research?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're doing something with the MOSI and MAPS data sets, correct?
Yes. So I think my bigger question has to do with you know, understanding different components that keep informing the population declines. This is a big, as many of you know, a big topic, and everybody tries to tackle a question in different ways. So I am using the MOSI and MAPS data for one of those questions, in particular, and collaborating with the Bird Genoscape project. So I'm interested in maybe seeing if the proportion of juveniles we're seeing across the wintering grounds for species such as the Wilson's warbler, if these have a demographic tie to where they're coming from. So knowing the genoscape in the winter and in the breeding, can we match these demographic or vital rates, say juvenile proportion to adult survival in the breeding grounds or to breeding productivity? And it's more of that's more of an exploratory question to try to understand this age distribution across the wintering grounds. And then I have a local question, which has to do with the working landscape in Honduras, because to try to understand these habitat loss through coffee, which is a big driver of that, and how this affects those migratory birds in a purely working landscape.
So a couple questions. Are there other places besides El Jaguar, which sort of follows the IOC model in the area where you're working in Honduras, that employ that Euro IOC model where it's being implemented or at least discussed?
Yes, so I have to mention that this IOC, or integrated open canopy idea, was born in Costa Rica, in fact. So, you know, I can definitely share with the network the research article from where this came from. But yes, there's in Nicaragua. And then within our working area, there are currently 20 IOC farms that have close to 200 hectares that are either forest or places in regeneration that have been set aside for that.
Great. Is there an opportunity for individuals or groups on the breeding grounds here in the Midwest, for example, to support MOSI stations?
Yes, I think that my collaborator in this talk, Steve Albert, is the perfect person to contact. You can contact them. Also, just making a direct connection with some of the stations I mentioned as well, some of the longest running stations I mentioned in my talk in Mexico and Nicaragua. But yes, if you write to us, we connect us. Even in Honduras, where there hasn't been a MOSI station in quite some time, through the Honduran Ornithological Society, there is already like a plan to restart a MOSI program.
Do you think, what's the reality of really transforming coffee farming from the sort of, from the standpoint of birds and the productive landscape, from sun coffee to a new model like IOC or bird-friendly coffee in general? What do you see as how hopeful are you that we can really make a difference that way? And what do you see as the components for making that difference?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that go into that, including things that are outside my area of expertise, including like sociocultural aspects of the area and what is driving a producer to have a particular farm type. It's also where it has to do with the capacity of managing a farm and where they produce in Honduras specifically, where they are in elevation. One thing we noticed is that some producers prefer to have shade coffee farms at lower elevations, around 800 meters. And then if they're at higher elevations where it's cooler and they can have influence from cloud forests and mist, then they transition and favor sun coffee. So I think that it's good to have options, and shade coffee is an option that sustains more biodiversity than sun. And then you have something like IOC, which sustains forest, which also has a higher diversity than sun coffee. So it's about working with the people and seeing what the capacity is on the ground and having options. That's what I see as I study in the area.
So what is our, how do we as coffee consumers, which I'm guessing 95% of us are, what can we do? I mean, is there a way we would know that a coffee comes from an IOC farm, or how do we increase the market? How do we increase the viability of that model on the market side?
Sure. So I want to mention two things. So specifically for IOC and this system that I presented to you today that attacks many links of that production chain, if you go to cafesolar.com, I placed it in my talk and I can look for it too. Café Solar is the brand of a coffee that comes from IOC. But you may be familiar with other certification schemes, such as the bird-friendly certification scheme, or there are other certifications that also do a step in the right direction to have say if you want to scale into like very damaging to the ecosystem versus friendly, that you can look for. So those are two things I would heed you to explore. And yes, if you want specific IOC coffee from this model, then you can go to the website. I think Sarah just posted it on the chat.
Great. So there's here's a comment from David LaPuma. It would be great to identify MOSI sites with infrastructure like power and internet and institutional support, people to care for those things for prioritizing MOSI stations. Those things aren't absolutely required. There are plenty of remote stations, but they make life much easier. Mm-hmm. There may be some available resources for offsetting the cost of some equipment for this purpose. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. Motor stations, he says. Yes, I think that it's wonderful. There's so much to be done, and there are people doing this work, and sometimes they're just not, here in this conversation. But we can try to be a link as much as we can to those people.
Great. Let me see. I think we've got most of the questions answered here that have come in. So, okay. Yeah, again, this is great. I encourage people to continue to interact with links that have been set up in the chat and to continue to pursue these conversations that we started, both all throughout the conference and also especially encouraging to me to think about ways in which we can complete the life cycle of birds, not just through the study of birds, but also through those connections that you so elegantly laid out for us, by building capacity, by creating relationships with Central and Mesoamerican biologists who are doing research, supporting that research, continuing to grow that community. I think that's really essential obviously to the ultimate conservation of birds that spend their lives in these two worlds and the worlds between them. So it's really, I think, encouraging to always to hear these stories of how much is really being done in Mesoamerica, how much capacity there really is, and how much enthusiasm and excitement there is to do the right thing with birds and people and the landscapes that nourish both of us. So again, Fabiola, thanks for that great talk. I'm sure many people will listen to it again. I will.
Well, with that computer mishap, but thank you very much, everyone, for your patience, and I will, I'll remain. So,
I don't think we saw the mess up, so I think you did well.
Okay, thank you.
All righty, again, thanks to the audience for the insightful questions that were coming in throughout the program, and again to you, Fabiola, for coming up to the Midwest. For our final word now, we'll turn the program over to Amber, Amber Roth, who's the coordinator of the Midwest Migration Network, and she'll provide some closing thoughts on the week's conference and maybe point us forward into the future. So Amber, you're on.
Amber, I unmuted you. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that.
Okay, thank you. That helps. I'm just figuring out which screen I need to share here. Let me see. Looks like my screen tried to, my presentation is not cooperating. Hang on one moment. I have to restart the presentation. It froze on me, of course. And presentation mode. All right. I think I've got the right screen here. Can you see the presentation?
Yep, we see your PowerPoint. Perfect.
Is that okay? Perfect. All right. Sorry about that. All right. I wanted to comment on Fabiola's presentation. I think another opportunity with Mosey is for the banders who are participating. There is no better opportunity than to volunteer to help on one of those Mosey stations. I've been fortunate to help out Lily and George at El Jawar in Nicaragua for a number of winters and help with their Mosey stations. And I will say that's just a tremendous experience. I've become a better bander as a consequence. It's great to see our breeding birds on their wintering grounds and what they look like and where they're spending their winter. Plus you have the added bonus of catching resident birds as well and being able to look at them in the hand. So I encourage folks to visit Mosey stations, perhaps under better circumstances in the future when we don't have COVID-19 travel restrictions. But I will say it's just really amazing experience. So I think there's another opportunity there. Well, I want to thank everyone for participating in the conference. First, I want to say some thank yous. I want to say thank you to Stephanie Bilkey, who's been our Zoom master and has been amazing at not only making sure the conference logistics move along smoothly, but had a big hand in the advertising and putting together a lot of the technical details ahead of time. So we couldn't have done it without Stephanie. Also, I want to thank Tom, who's been wonderful moderating through the whole conference. Our planning team did a great job planning this conference. That includes Stephanie, Tom, Jennifer Phillips Vanderberg, Joel Merriman, Ralph Grundle, and myself. And a big shout out to the initiative leaders that put together 4 wonderful sessions over the last 3 days. Just really interesting, great speakers, great content, great questions, just really informative sessions. Really enjoyed participating in those. And I want to thank our keynote and initiative session speakers. Wonderful presentations from people all over, actually all over the world. I think we had somebody that was presenting at midnight today in their time zone. And thank you to all the members and participants in this conference. You've all had wonderful questions and have been very thoughtful about your Zoom etiquette, and we've really had a great conference, and that's largely because you've made it successful. So thank you for your participation. Previously, I mentioned our steering committee, and just in the course of the last 2 days, we've added 4 new steering committee members. So I want to take a moment to welcome them. That's Anna Buckart-Thomas from Iowa DNR, Alexis Grind from NRRI at UM Duluth, Jared Wolf from Michigan Tech University, and Rich Keith at Kalamazoo Valley Bird Observatory. I'm really excited about them joining our steering committee and bringing in new perspectives and energy, and looking forward to working with them. Okay, I was asked to reflect a little bit on the conference. It's always a challenge at the end to think about what are kind of the big take-home messages. Clearly, one of them was the amount of information that came out of the 6 sessions we've had was truly impressive. We learned a lot about the state of bird migration, about new technologies, old technologies, how to use them together, and new science efforts in the region and beyond. So just amazing amount of information. I just want to highlight some of the things that we went over in each of those sessions. So our opening session was a great overview of the challenges that migratory birds are facing and what we are facing in terms of trying to help them. And clearly, these big collaborative efforts are necessary to be able to make big impacts. During the banding and ground survey session, there was a great overview of the standardized banding and survey protocols. And I hope that these become the standard that complements MAPS and MOSI as sort of the missing piece in the annual life cycle for banding our migratory birds. Mark mentioned the important role of the bird banding lab and how important that collaboration has been. And it was really pointed out during this session how important these standardized banding programs are, particularly as they are trying to address larger questions that are difficult to answer by single stations or single studies. So I think there's a lot of potential through the collaborations being built in this initiative. The other piece, this is one slide from Mark's presentation that I found to be very compelling, is the types of data that come out of this standardized banding effort and the importance of species-specific understanding that we gain about migration timing, other aspects of migration ecology, as well as population demographics. During the Wind and Wildlife Coalition session, I was blown away, that not to be punny, but by the amount of information that's available from oceanic offshore wind projects and the potential of those projects informing what might be happening on the Great Lakes and how we develop best management practices to protect birds, bats, and other animals moving across the water. It was clear that for the Great Lakes, there are considerable data and information needs. And I am excited for this coalition because I think it will really help move forward the collection of data to be able to inform siting decisions for these new projects and to develop best management practices that are specific to our Great Lakes region. And also it was very clear from some of these other studies that having good information is really critical for minimizing mortality as well as minimizing other ecological impacts to the lake ecosystem. Moving on to the telemetry session. I think one comment that Stu made that really stood out for me was that MODIS is a great example of community science. And what that means is anybody can put a station on their house, or they can work with a local nature center or a school or a business. There's just a huge list of possibilities of where MODIS stations potentially could go and who can be involved. So I think, this is a really great opportunity for just about anybody to be involved. And clearly it's a tool that's helping us better understand full annual cycle of migrating animals. And I'm excited for the possibility of all the new stations that we discussed during that session. So hopefully all that funding comes through so we can make that happen. Another thing that came out of this is that MODIS often is thought about in terms of these long range movement questions and understanding big migratory movements, but it was also pointed out how important they are for understanding local movements and where animals are going and the timing of when they arrive and leave from breeding locations or stopover locations. So there are a lot of local questions that are important as well. So there's the opportunity for stations to answer both types of questions. From the radar and acoustics group, really impressive how far radar has come and how that can be used to show regional, spatial and temporal patterns for stopovers. There's a lot of discussion about all the characteristics that can be correlated with radar data, including understanding hotspots and how those relate to urban light islands, whether they attract or whether birds are averted by those areas, associations with various habitat types. As Jeff mentioned, I also found the socioeconomic aspects of it to be really fascinating and the potential for understanding those relationships as well as other land use patterns. It's clear that we are in a computer age where we have the ability now to work with immense amounts of data, and that was really clear in this session. We're talking about these big data sets from radar and eBird and other sources and how we can combine those at really large scales, including the Midwest region, but also across the continent. And then this current session, I think Fabiola made a lot of sense in terms of how important it is to think about how we are connected to birds and the land and land use. And I put by bird-friendly coffee here. That's just one part of it, but it's certainly a role that any of us can play in terms of just simple everyday decisions that we make that actually have potential influence on what's happening on the wintering grounds. And finally, having been involved with this network almost from the beginning, it's clear that this network has come a long ways and that there has been a lot of energy and projects connected to it. And I'm really proud of all that's been done so far, but clearly we have a lot more work to do moving forward, I think, until we start recovering some of these declining bird populations and start regaining the 3 billion birds lost. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. All right, so that was one big take-home message. The other two are that we have a lot of impressive projects that are underway, and that I think they're going to have positive impacts on our migrating birds. And perhaps most importantly, there are a lot of passionate, engaged people in the Midwest and beyond who are really interested in trying to make a difference. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for folks to get involved through the Midwest Migration Network, as well as in other ways. So I was just kind of brainstorming some ideas of how participants can be more involved with the network and some of the roles that folks potentially can play. There's been mention of this through many of the sessions, but these were some of the ideas I gleaned from the last 3 days. One is, if you're a bander or if you work for a banding station, there's a protocol out there for you. Hopefully you can get involved with the banding ground survey session or initiative. Anybody can be a MODA station host if you're in a location that can support a tower. And there is some work involved, and it's not something that's just plug and play, but it does take some learning and such. But I think once you have your tower up and running, it can be very smooth. And I see the opportunity for individuals, bird groups, NGOs, even amateur radio operators to get involved with MODIS. And on the technical side, if you're somebody that likes electronics and like helping others, I mean, we need people to help set up these stations. Not everybody is a whiz at figuring out how to connect all the electronics together and making sure the antennas are positioned correctly and that kind of thing. So if this kind of thing, this kind of electrical opportunity is of interest to you, we need people that have technical expertise to help other people get their stations up and running, or to help them troubleshoot problems that they're having. Clearly, there's a role for scientists and students to participate in this research. I think every time we have a meeting, we connect with new scientists out there. And I think some of the comments earlier about trying to find new ways for the network to connect more folks together, I think was a really great suggestion. Within the network, we have a need for people who want to help us with writing grants and finding funding. Like many organizations, we are very capacity limited, and the more resources we have, the more we're able to do. And I wanted to mention that we do have a donation button on our website. So if you are inclined to make a donation, there's a mechanism in place for that. And finally, as we were talking, there were so many things that we could do with our website. We send out newsletters, we have social media, but we're really limited in how much we have time for. So if you're somebody that likes to play around with websites, I think we have all sorts of things that we would like to add to our website, but just have not had the time to do it. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for folks to get involved, and certainly any of the 4 initiatives are welcoming members. So if you were excited by any of the sessions you were part of, please think about joining. So that brings up the next question. How do you join? Well, if you go to the MidwestMigrationNetwork.org website, this is the homepage. There's a membership menu item. If you click on that, a form will pop up. You can put your information in there. It's very simple. Your name, where you live, what's your email address, which of the 4 initiatives are you interested in being a part of, and click, and you're done. And you are now on our mailing list for upcoming events and updates with our newsletter in terms of what we're doing. You will not get a lot of email, but you will get the important pieces of what the network's doing. You can also get involved with our Facebook page. This is a closed group, so you will have to answer a couple of questions in order to join. And it's not, the content of the group is not really visible outside of being a member. And I will say, just in the course of the 3 days, we are now up to 79 members on our Facebook page. I think I added 2 right during the start of the session even. So it's you know, a great way to stay connected. As was mentioned earlier, a lot of the latest research is posted there, as well as network events and opportunities to get involved are posted there as well. Finally, one more opportunity to see email addresses for the various initiative leaders. Also, my email address is there if you have a more general network question or interested in getting involved in other ways that it may not be specific to the initiatives listed here. And finally, after the conference, we will be making recordings of each session available. We will send out a message that will tell you where to find those recordings. They should be, we will probably put links on our website. They will probably be in YouTube. Also look for an evaluation. We'd like to hear your thoughts about how the conference went, whether you experienced any problems with Zoom. Obviously, several of the presenters had some problems, so sometimes as a participant, you have similar problems as well. We'd like to know more, particularly if we end up doing a similar kind of conference in the future. And with that, I want to thank everyone for participating.